That was really fast. All right. Welcome back to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. We're picking up our conversation about dispatch. And Maria, thanks for being here. Could you introduce yourself and take us through this draft 1.1?
Of course, Maria Royal with Legislative Council. It's nice to be in this committee room. Meet all of you. Many of you are not familiar to me. So, yes, so there is a draft. It's posted online under my name. And this is actually language. There are two sections here that are part of the Senate passed language on the big bill, or now it's in conference, but it came up on the Senate side. So these two provisions are reflected, those two provisions are reflected in this draft. Any changes, proposed changes are highlighted in yellow or blue. And blue are kind of questions, blanks you need to fill in, or dates that you might want to just confirm. Because I wasn't able to just get that confirmation beforehand. So I'll start walking through the proposal, and just not really sure what level of detail. Do you want to do real line by line? Because I know some of you may be more or less familiar. What would be most helpful?
I think that Representative Hager, go ahead.
Sorry, unless I need to refresh or something, it's coming up as a page that doesn't exist, Maria's testimony or link.
It's under, I just pulled it up, it's a 10-page.
Refresh it? Okay.
Yeah, it's a
Thank you.
10-page document.
Sorry about that.
I just want to make sure everybody can see the language.
And this is the 6:12 a.m.
Yes.
Oh, now it's up. Thank you.
So I think it would be good to, as we go over the new language, to go line by line. I think we can summarize the stuff at the top, for instance, because the committee's seen that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, that's what I wasn't sure. So the new language is in subsection C, starts on page 1, line 17. And this basically changes who is going to oversee this process to a new statewide public safety communication system. So in the budget language, it was the E911 board. The proposed language, in consultation with a number of executive branch officials. So the way it's proposed now, it would be the Commissioner of Public Safety in consultation with the Public Safety Communications Steering Committee, which is established in subsection D, which is also a new entity. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So actually, we'll talk about that right away on page 2. So you can see in subdivision D1, establishment of this new steering committee, which shall advise the Commissioner of Public Safety on all phases of the development, design, and implementation of a statewide public safety communication system, including with respect to the retention of a project manager and any consultants, the development and review of preliminary and final design plans, the transition and implementation process, and any proposed pilot projects developed pursuant to subsection F, which is also new language, authority to fund pilot projects. And we'll get to that later on. In terms of the membership on the steering committee, there are 7 members, including the executive director of the 911 board, the Secretary of Digital Services or designee, the Commissioner of Public Service or designee, 1 municipal officer appointed by the executive director of VLCT, 1 representative from a public safety answering point overseen by a municipal police department, and you need an appointing authority for that. So I'll just tell you, there are 3 municipal police departments that serve as a PSAP. They do call taking and they do dispatching. And those are in Shelburne, St. Albans, and Hartford. So 1 representative from one of those entities. 1 first responder, so 1 firefighter, emergency medical technician, or paramedic appointed by, and you'll need an appointing authority there. And then also included on page 3 is the chair of the Regional Dispatch Working Group that you set up last session. And that's Paul White. So subdivision 3 just provides, some of this is boilerplate. At the initial organizational meeting, the committee shall elect from among its members a chair and vice chair. Meetings held at the call of the chair at the request of 2 members or at the request of the Commissioner of Public Safety. So that's for your consideration, whether you want the commissioner to be able to convene. I haven't in the past done that, but this is kind of an interesting setup where the commissioner is doing a bulk of the work, but asking for the advice and consent of a steering committee, and whether you want the commissioner to be able to call a meeting of the steering committee. Rest of the language, majority of city members shall constitute a quorum. Action taken by the committee may be authorized by majority of members present and voting. And there's just the compensation for the non-state employee members, reimbursement for expenses. And then in subdivision 4, it provides that the Department of Public Safety shall provide the committee with administrative services and support. Later on, when we look at the appropriation, there's a provision that says that this expense will come from that $11 million in general fund. Just wanted to highlight that. And then all meetings are open to the public, and all records are subject to the Vermont Public Records Act. This committee will cease to exist, and this is for your consideration. It's proposed July 1st, 2029, and that's what.
Great. I was going to ask about this. Is that pretty typical kind of sunset language on the budget side? Because we typically, when we have like a council or a commission, we'll put a sunset on the section that establishes that committee as opposed to saying they'll cease to exist. I was just wondering how often that language is used on the budget side.
I don't know so much about just budget generally. The only reason why you could do it any number of ways. I think the only reason why it's in here separately is because that sunset of the committee might not correspond with the commissioner's authority with respect to the transition process. But if you're envisioning that all of this work and the commissioner has done what she needs to do, then you can sunset the whole section. That's true. Yeah.
I don't think that's what we want to do just yet. So we'll figure that out before 20.
Okay.
I'm not too concerned.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure the construction that we're using isn't too far off from what we usually do. Sure,
of course. So then E is, so this is where you're basically saying that all this development and transition it happens in 3 phases, but they may happen simultaneously or certain aspects of it. And so the phases include the inventory, the data collection analysis, the design, which includes the whole system, operationally, technologically, but also looking at financing and governance models. So that's all part of the design process. And then the implementation, and as you'll see later on, part of that might be the funding of pilot projects that will help to develop or advance a new system or inform. So those are the phases. And the only changes that were made to the existing language in the budget, you'll see on page 4. Yeah. So one, a change to the date. It says on or before December 1st, 2024. So that would be when the complete inventory is supposed to be done, the whole inventory. There is in the report that's required in January to give a progress report on any of the data that has been collected by January of next year. But it's envisioned that all of the work, the mapping of dead zones, will be able to be completed by December 1st, 2024. Then with respect to the total spending on dispatch service in Vermont on line 15, page 4, just greater specificity here. It says, current total spending on dispatch service in Vermont that includes and itemizes for each municipality and dispatch center all federal, state, and municipal appropriations and fees, every contract for dispatch or first responder service, and projected budgets. So then moving on to the design portion, starts on bottom of page 5, line 19. And so this specifies that, and no change here, but just highlighted again to make sure all the dates work for you. It says on or before January 15th of next year, the commissioner shall develop findings and recommendations related to draft elements of a preliminary design for the system, including identification of a proposed implementation timeline and any additional data and resources needed to develop a final design on or before January 15th, 2025. So no change in those dates. But I just wanted to highlight them. As far as what's in the final design, the only change starting at the bottom of page 6, subdivision H, concerning the governance model, the existing language specifies that we're looking for a recommended governance model to ensure effective state and regional oversight, management, and continuous improvement of the system, including identification of staffing or operational needs, support such oversight and management of the system, and then deleting by the board, was the 911 board, or by another state agency if deemed appropriate by the board. So not calling that out specifically, but leaving it a little more open-ended in terms of the governance, statewide governance. And then F at the bottom of page 7, this is the authority to fund pilot projects, and this is new. It specifies that on line 19, if the commissioner determines that sufficient minimum technical and operational standards have been developed to warrant the funding of one or more pilot projects in geographical areas of the state that presently face significant challenges with respect to reliably providing dispatch service, the commissioner may submit a pilot project proposal to the Joint Fiscal Committee in this calendar year. The proposal shall include a description of each project, the resources needed, and an explanation of how the project will align with, inform, and further the development of a statewide public safety communication system. And then it says that the JFC is authorized to approve up to whatever amount you choose for pilot projects authorized by this subsection. Then G is the report that you'll get next January, so no change to that date. Commissioner shall submit a progress report on the data collection and analysis, as well as the findings and recommendations regarding the elements of a preliminary design plan. Goes for the relevant standing committees of jurisdiction. And those are the changes to the substantive provisions. On line 15, you'll see these are the proposed amendments to the appropriation. So these appear as amendments to last year's $11 million appropriation that had gone to the Department of Public Safety. You see on line 20, the budget language has now being transferred to the 911 board. So this would revert. So there would be no change. The money would stay where it is currently, which is with the Department of Public Safety. And then on page 9 of that amount, up to $2 million shall be available for the retention of technical experts to assist the commissioner with regional dispatch analysis and planning as required by this act, and to fund the administrative expenses incurred by the steering committee. And then in subdivision 2, whatever amount you would like to appropriate and have available for the funding of pilot projects. Any remaining amount shall be held in reserve until approval to expend the funds is granted by the General Assembly. And that is pretty much it. The rest is just, replacing commissioner for the 911 board. That final, just for your awareness, if you didn't know this already, that final subdivision 4 is referring to the the federal dollars, the 9 million in federal dollars that the Commissioner of Public Safety has currently. And this is basically just saying that the use of those funds shall be consistent with the overall plan to the extent possible. And the Commissioner shall consult with the steering committee as the federal parameters for expending the funds become available, and also update the Joint Fiscal Committee on any planned expenditures. That's everything.
So, Maria, I want to say thank you, because you sat through a meeting yesterday where a whole lot of people threw a whole lot of ideas around. And I think that you did a great first pass at trying to capture some of that and leave us with some questions that we still need to work on. So, Representative Chase, go ahead.
Just double check my understanding. The final report would be due in December of 24, and the final plan for what to do as a result of that would be January of 25. Okay. So that's a month and a half, which is.
Well, and that's a good question. So that December report is that what you're asking about? Are you asking about the
Yeah.
progress preliminary report?
The final report, let me find the line item here.
Yeah, so I think
Page 4, line 3. It says on or before December 1st, 2024, the commissioner shall complete the report, and then the final plan of what to do, the design, line 5, page 19, so it's January 15th.
well, so, yeah.
Sorry, page 6, line 2.
Yep. So just to go over that timeline again, so it's really clear. So funding for pilot projects this calendar year, January 15th next year, you'll get a progress report on the data collection and any preliminary design elements. December of that year, so after you're out of session, that's when the inventory, all the data collection, propagation studies, mapping is complete. The final design plan for the whole system is January 15th, 25. So yeah, a month and a half after the inventory is complete. But there'll be some designing going on contemporaneously with the planning. Some of the propagation studies might take a lot longer than the other inventory and data collection. So, but thank you for pointing that out. That's part of what I wanted to make sure all these dates work for you.
So I think that the most useful thing, unless anybody has questions about the words on the page, is to hear from Commissioner Morrison about her feedback about the overarching concept. And then everybody sit with this and we'll come back to it tomorrow because we're going to have floor conversation about S39 and want to have time for people to actually read through this and think about who's on the steering committee. Does this actually work? And if there are changes we need to make tomorrow before we make a recommendation. So Commissioner Morrison.
1 second, just taking a quick note to myself.
Oh, yep. Take your time.
Good afternoon, committee. My name is Jennifer Morrison. I'm the Commissioner of Public Safety. And I just read this as I walked in the door about 15, 20 minutes ago. But I didn't break out in tears, so I think that's a good start.
It's a low bar when it comes to and regional dispatch conversations. Thanks for acknowledging that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I have to continue to look at the bright side of all of this, which is this is more progress than we've made in 57 years of discussing this. So we have to be really keep that in mind, that we are moving in the right direction. And I have said all along that moving forward is the only thing we can do, because to stop now would be really a terrible in many directions. So thank you. And Maria, thank you for all your hard work on not just here, but on the other side as well, trying to put this on paper in a way that reflects what people have mentioned. I was happy to see in this draft that there is some emphasis on answering the governor's second overarching question, his two overarching questions. The first one is addressed in the first paragraph, that it is the function of state government to provide a resilient and good public emergency communication system. The second one is how do we pay for it? And I guess I would say that this draft nibbles at the edges of that, but I think the governor would feel a lot more comfortable endorsing this direction if it more clearly calls out that in addition to studying, I don't remember exactly where I found it, but in addition to looking at on page 7, line 4, that it really should be called out clearly to make recommendations or to provide options for sustainable funding. I don't think that it should necessarily, the subject matter experts are going to be able to come up with the one path forward, but I think that if we're engaging in this work, that we should clearly signal that we are taking the governor's second question very seriously, which is let's have a menu of what are the possible paths forward to pay for a emergency communication system going forward. I also think that it would help some of the potential pilot projects who have been reluctant to move because of their discomfort with not knowing what the long-term funding mechanism for such a center would be, that if they know that it is definitely called out in statute that we have to have something to choose from at the end of this journey, that might give them some comforture. So,
Commissioner, at what point in this kind of a timeline do you think we should be, because we're envisioning here kind of a preliminary report coming before the start of the next legislative session in December. Mm-hmm. Is that the point at which you would be suggesting that we make it clear that the steering committee should be suggesting the menu of options?
I don't think that work can be done by then. Yeah. I don't think we can get there. I mean, I think I envision that there's going to be multiple lanes running, various subject matter experts running in different lanes at the same time that will intersect from time to time. But it will take time for somebody to review what is already on the books, but perhaps not being leveraged in terms of fees or taxes, to look at how other states are funding their system. I just think it's going to probably take some time, and we won't have a final menu of choices for probably until the January 25 date would be my guess. But again, I'm really spitballing this on the fly. But I think that it's important that the statute acknowledge the governor's two main questions that have kept us, the executive branch, a little bit on the sidelines in this, that these questions need to be answered. Right. That's just my feedback on behalf of the team. I do envision that the subject matter experts are going to shine a lot of light on the topic for all stakeholders involved. And again, this is just a once over and listening to Maria do the walkthrough, but I'd like to see a little more room to embrace the subject matter experts' input on how we should move forward. There's a lot of what feel to me as deadlines in here without that kind of presuppose what the action steps are going to be. I'd have to have a minute to sit with this to recommend specific language, but as a general sense, I want to acknowledge that we are going to be relying on people who have information and technical expertise and experience that we don't have, and that's why we need them. So we need to make sure that we haven't put them in too tight a corner, that there's considerable latitude allowed for the steering committee or whomever that entity is to use that information and adjust course as necessary. I guess the last thing I want to mention is that I thought at one point, and I know there've been a lot of different iterations of this, that we had, that somewhere along the way it was envisioned that there would be a short-term, like an interim advisory board until we have a plan, a final plan. And I think that one of the things we have to be open to is that the subject matter experts will tell us what the steering committee or advisory board or oversight board for this project should look like. So while I don't have any necessary objection at first glance to the steering committee you've put together that is reflected in this draft, I am shooting from the hip here, having not consulted any of my colleagues or the governor's office, but I would rather see that be an interim board and allow us to get the feedback from the subject matter experts and see how it's going with that steering committee. And then have one of the parts of the plan be what is the permanent oversight structure, just as the E911 board is the permanent oversight structure of that piece of the universe. What should the permanent board look like? And I will take this opportunity to say that there is an executive order 5-19 that exists that established the Emergency Communications Advisory Committee. It is, all the seats are currently vacant. I think it was a victim of COVID and a change in leadership at DPS. But there does currently exist a body that, by executive order, that could be fine-tuned. The membership, I don't think, would reflect what we want here, and the charge certainly would need to be fine-tuned. But I raise that by way of saying that there are options out there for what the permanent oversight structure of such a massive endeavor should be. So I would recommend that we sunset that board once a new oversight body is identified, perhaps in January of 25, but.
Yeah, I think that the folks who were involved in the conversation over the last couple of days on the House side, at least, were envisioning this as just an interim step. So even though the steering committee is really about guiding the work of all of this gathering and planning, not the actual implementation, standing up of centers other than obviously the pilots. So I think we're heading in that direction. We should probably all kind of walk away with this language and say, do we need to call it something differently or set it up slightly differently? But unless I misunderstood the folks in the room, we weren't expecting the steering committee to be the permanent oversight authority for all public safety communications in the state. This was really about having some interdisciplinary group that was tasked with guiding the work of the consultant and the project manager.
Understood.
Yes, the next place.
Yeah, I think we're going to learn a lot in this process. And so that's why I just think we have to be open to what the permanent structure does look like. And I didn't know if by keeping a sunset that ran so far out in the future, if somehow we would be dissing a future oversight body if we dismissed this group before that date.
I mean, I don't have any problem with directing Maria in the next draft to say that, the steering committee shall exist until a permanent oversight body for statewide public safety communications is established or something like that, unless anybody on the committee has a problem with that. And that might sort of allay any concern that we're thinking the steering committee is going to run the show forever.
And other than that, again, this is a very quick run through. I will think on this, I'm sure, all through the middle of the night, friends, all night long. This one will be in my brain. But I do appreciate that you recognize the resource drain on our department that even getting this far has been, and by allowing us to draw down funding from that previously appropriated $11 million to provide an administrative assistant is going to go a large way to not dispirit my team. So that's a very positive development from my perspective. I guess I'll leave my remarks there and answer questions.
Representative Rowe.
Sure.
I hear you emphasize that the key questions from the governor. And it might be helpful for us, because I feel like we're in a dark room groping for the light switch as to what, in terms of funding, the governor would or would not support. Is there anything that you can suggest to us, a direction that we might go that he would support or wouldn't support in terms of funding?
Well, I haven't had a one-on-one with him about this specifically, but as we all know, he's sort of a no new fees, no new taxes in a time of prosperity. But we all know we're running into different economic times in the coming years. So I think that is an area I would need to get more direction from before I publicly represent a position of the governor. It's not impossible that there are already statutes on the book where revenue is not being collected that could be maximized, that wouldn't necessarily qualify as new fees or taxes, but perhaps they're not being maximized currently. And I think that he would be very interested in how other states are paying for it. And so as to not create an onerous burden that is above and beyond what is happening in other states on taxpayers. And I know he'll be interested in equity and it not disproportionately impacting lower income folks.
Yeah, and I think you had mentioned maybe something on page 7, basically under the final design plan in regards to some options for possible sources of funding. So I don't see a problem with that really at this point.
Yeah, I guess my question for the commissioner would be, and you don't have to answer this now, but would be over the next, by tomorrow morning, I would say, if you have a suggestion for language that would beef up our call for the study of funding mechanisms here, we worked in language into the working group at like the last minute that I wrote and then gave to John and Sarah last biennium and to try to get at this, but asking the working group to do that, they didn't have the expertise, they weren't resourced to do that, and so we really need to do that well here. And so if you have language that would help us get stronger there. A couple of things that I would say in response to your comments, Commissioner, is that I think that the group that was discussing this yesterday believes that there are probably efficiencies to be gained in looking at the entire inventory that we're asking for in this language of where money's being spent on out-of-state contracts and staffing different offices in various municipalities. If we were providing regional dispatching 20 years from now in just a select number of centers that were covering everything for everybody at a really high quality, we're probably going to be able to do more for less. And I don't know if we're all in agreement on sort of exactly where the economic headwinds are going, given the uncertainty right now. But all of that said, I think we all want efficiency and we all want a high level of service, and then getting to good, everybody up to a standard. We've sort of checked that box here. We've said we want to have sort of a statewide goal of interoperability. But I think the next level down of, we're not necessarily saying in any of this that we're going to get rid of what's working. And we're actually really explicit here that the dispatch systems that are working, we're trying to preserve what works and build on that. So I'm wondering how you feel about us in terms of, especially releasing the pilot project, saying that there are some criteria around, where's the need, and also where is there already a local match and a readiness to deploy a regional center and do work, and sort of looking at those couple of criteria for the release of the pilots. Is that something that you have?
Local interest in being a regional center is a lot different from preparedness to be a regional center. So obviously the path we had been on prior to this legislative session required the willingness of potential regional partners. We needed people who wanted to get in the game despite not knowing what the long-term funding formula was going to be. So I do believe there are willing partners out there who have put a lot of work into this over the last 5 years to be ready, and who are counting on the state providing them some costs, whether those are capital costs or equipment costs, to get them over the hump and into operational readiness. So I do think that that even on a temporary basis before money goes out the door, that we need to talk about criteria, like what is governance? When we say you have to have a governance structure, we probably need to draw a little bit more compelling of a word picture of what that means. When we talk about using state funding for purchasing equipment, we need to spec that out so that anything purchased with state dollars is consistent with other stuff in the field that can be interoperable. So I think there's a little bit of work to do on setting standards, even on a pilot project before money goes out the door. And I'd be happy to dive into that more if we need to. But that's one of the lessons we learned from the path we had been on, which is that you need to have a more structure around what a regional partner would look like. And then between lines 4 and 16, page 7, I wrote in my notes in the margin, I wrote need clarity. We probably should mention somewhere in here that one of the goals is to equitably fund it. It has to be recommendations on equitable funding, because there might be, as you recognize, a strong yearn for local control in some places that don't want to change the fact that they're dispatching for themselves. And then the question is, are they then going to have to also contribute to a statewide scheme of regional dispatching? I don't know. I'm just putting out there that equity, clearly calling out that this is not just do an inventory of how much it costs right now and how much it might cost in the future, but how do we build a sustainable funding model for this? I think would give the governor more comfort than what I've perceived on my first quick read through of this. So that's just a little bit of a.
I think we want to get to the same place.
Yes.
So since we're going to have to go back up to the floor in just a moment or two here, do you think it's realistic that you could take a little bit of a deeper look at this in the next 24 hours and provide us with some feedback?
Yes.
I will say that I have the same reaction that you do, Commissioner Morrison, in that I was hoping that this committee would get weeks to really take testimony, to really understand this, to do really thorough work on this. And I think we recognize that we can't just punt, that we do need to join you in the call to get doing what we can now.
Yes.
Our Senate colleagues, they really tried to answer that governor's second question. And I think that some of the folks on the Senate side said, we're not quite there yet. We got to get more of this information before we're willing to commit to that. So there's a strong move toward a statewide funding model that had every town paying up and then money redistributed. Might have been too much too fast. Not sure about that because we never got to look at it in depth. But if we need to do more of a nod to that here to bring a comfort level for your office as the sort of key holder of the steering committee and some of this work, I just want to make sure we've got the right language in there as best we can in the limited time we have here at the end of the session.
Yeah, I don't perceive it as a deal breaker if it flew out of here as written. I believe there's room for this to be interpreted by the steering committee to say, okay, consultants, we need you to provide us with, and that'll be part of drafting RFPs, right? Is that we could use the RFP to frame the language of we want options. We want to know what is currently out there. So there are other ways to get at this. I'm merely making sure I represent the governor's top 2 priorities on this topic. So if it flew out of here as is, we could use the RFP process to be more clear.
I guess the last ask I would have for you for feedback is we have some open questions about how much of the money should be fenced and how much should we say that could be released for pilot projects. And I don't need you to answer this on the spot now, but if that's something you can make a recommendation on before we make a formal recommendation for language for the budget conferees, that would be really helpful.
It's a very hard question to answer because let's just say, what if Rutland says, yep, pick me? That could be a capital build. I don't know, it could be retrofitting a building. So it could be 9 million or it could be 1.5 million, right? To get something like that going. It just totally depends on where somebody is in the process. If you look at our partners in Chittenden County. They have a location, they have the ability to tax and go out to bond. They're legal, the way they've done it is unique. And so that might be a much smaller nut. That could be $1 to $2 million to get them everything they need. I'm aware that our friends in Central Vermont, in Montpelier and Barry, feel that they're quite close to being able to turn on a regional dispatch partner. And I believe they're asked, Steve, you would know, it's like 2.4 million? 3.4. I shaved down the $800,000 in consulting costs to tell them something that it was for a consulting cost that we didn't think was viable. So 2.4 million.
Would it make sense for us to give more leeway to you and with the guidance of the steering committee to go to JFC with the kind of the interim pilot proposal and say, joint fiscal, we believe these projects have met our minimum standards. We've, got those back from the consultant and we think these are ready for release of funds. Do you think that's the right mechanism to sort of give more guidance and flexibility?
I think we have to, yes, but I think we have to set the standards first so that we are making sure that any pilot project is further structured and guardrailed than the process we engaged in a year ago. So, yes, and I think it wouldn't hurt for, I'll just leave it there. I think that if we can get a couple of pilot projects online, it will, that are successful and that meaningfully redistribute how the service is provided across the state so that there is no one catastrophe in the making if a center goes down and that there is an equitable pay-in structure to it. I think it's going to give a lot of confidence to future regional dispatch operators that, yes, we can build it and it doesn't have to all be one size fits all. Like I said, the way the Chittenden County folks are going about it is very different than the way Central Vermont has gone after it or the way St. Albans and Shelburne are currently operating. So there is no one size fits all.
All right, well, the bells are ringing for us. And Commissioner, thank you for your conversation, partnership, feedback on this. We'll be in touch offline, hopefully, before we get back to this tomorrow at some point. I'm hoping we can at least make kind of a preliminary recommendation across the hall by tomorrow, and then maybe we'll do a little bit of back and forth next week as the folks try to wrap up the budget. I can't imagine we'll have every question answered in 24 hours, but we're starting to get to a place where I think we're all rowing in the same direction. So thank you.
Yes, I agree. Thank you very much for all your